The kids thought Diesel was just playing when he leapt at the classroom map, but when the paper ripped, he revealed something that had been hidden for 20 years. The end of the school day at Maple Hollow Elementary was usually filled with the hum of voices and the scraping of chairs as children gathered their bags and teachers tried to keep order for just a few minutes longer. The big clock above the blackboard ticked steadily toward 3 o'clock, and sunlight spilled through the windows in bright stripes across the desks. Diesel, the German shepherd, who had become almost as much a part of the school as the flag outside, lay at ease near the door, his ears flicking at every sound. He was there as both a guardian and a comfort, a retired canine brought back to duty by his handler, Deputy Claire Harlow, who often visited classrooms to talk about safety and to let the children pet the dog they adored. Today seemed no different, until Diesel's body went rigid, his nose twitching as if he had caught a scent that no one else could notice. At first, no one paid much attention, not even Claire, who was chatting with the principal by the hallway door. But Diesel rose to his feet in an instant, his claws clicking against the linoleum as he crossed the room. He didn't head toward the door or the children. He went straight for the enormous map of the county that hung on the far wall, a map that had been there for longer than most of the teachers could remember. The suddenness of it made the children laugh nervously, some cheering him on as if it were a game, until he leapt and tore into the canvas with his teeth. The sound of ripping paper filled the classroom. "Diesel!" Claire shouted, rushing forward, but the dog didn't stop. His growl echoed low and sharp, vibrating in the still air. The children fell silent. Teachers froze in the doorway. Diesel ripped again, his body throwing itself into the task with desperate determination, as though the map itself were alive and threatening. Finally, with a loud snap, the map tore from the top nails and crumpled to the ground. Behind it, taped flat against the wall, was something no one expected. A bundle of envelopes, old and yellowed, was secured with brittle tape. Beside them, a small plastic bag held a thin black flash drive. For a moment, no one moved, the classroom still filled with the sharp scent of dust and the faint glue of old tape. The children stared wide-eyed, whispering to one another, and one little boy clutched his backpack like a shield. Claire crouched by Diesel, placing a steadying hand on his back. His fur was bristling, his breath fast, but his eyes were fixed on the hidden items. He had not made a mistake. He had found something. The principal stepped forward, voice trembling as he said it must be some kind of prank, something left over from a forgotten project. But Diesel growled again, a sound that made even the adults take a step back. The envelopes looked fragile, but what lay inside them carried a weight that pressed against the air of the classroom. And though no one could yet know what secrets the dog had pulled from the wall, every person there felt it deep down. Something about the calm afternoon had changed forever, and it had begun with Diesel tearing down a map that no one had ever thought to question. Claire pushed her way through the crowded hallway and into the classroom, her boots echoing on the linoleum as she hurried to Diesel's side. The children were pressed back against the desks, wide-eyed and hushed, while the torn county map lay in a heap on the floor. Diesel stood stiff, his teeth bared and his eyes locked on the bare wall where the envelopes and flash drive had been revealed. His chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his growl low and steady like a warning. Claire dropped to one knee and touched his flank, feeling the tremble of muscle beneath his thick coat. She whispered his name, trying to calm him, but he didn't look at her. His focus was fixed, as if he could still smell something dangerous lingering in the plaster itself. The principal, a man named Mr. Hall, cleared his throat and puffed out his chest, though his face was pale. He told everyone it was nothing more than a childish prank, maybe old school projects left behind years ago. His voice was too loud, too quick, and the way his eyes darted to the pile of yellowed envelopes betrayed his calm words. He crouched to pick them up, but Diesel snapped his jaws together with a sound that made the man flinch back in shock. The room went silent again, the air heavy, as if waiting for someone to admit the truth that no one wanted to speak. Claire straightened slowly, her hand firm on Diesel's collar. She told the principal they couldn't just brush it off, that the dog was trained, that he didn't react this way without reason. She could feel every eye on her, students and teachers alike, their faces caught between fear and disbelief. Diesel's growl deepened, vibrating against her palm, and she knew he wasn't about to stand down. He was telling her, in the only way he could, that something was wrong. It was then that a sound broke the tension, a voice soft, almost too quiet to hear. One of the younger teachers, a woman with nervous eyes and hair pulled back too tight, spoke from near the door. She looked as though she might faint, her hands gripping the edge of a desk for balance. "That map," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That map has been hanging there for 20 years. The words spread through the room like a chill, each person turning to look at her, then back to the wall where the map had been. Claire's stomach tightened. 20 years. The way the teacher said it wasn't just fact, it was fear, like she had been waiting for someone to pull it down all this time. Claire asked her what she meant, but the young woman only shook her head, her lips pressed tight, as if speaking more might unravel something she wasn't ready to face. Diesel whined and nudged his nose toward the wall again, his whole body tense with purpose. Claire realized this wasn't just a ripped map, and it wasn't a prank. It was the beginning of something hidden, something the dog had forced them all to see, and no amount of denial could put it back behind the plaster. Claire took a steadying breath as she crouched near the wall where Diesel had ripped the map down. The envelopes looked fragile, their edges curled and browned with age, as though they had been waiting in the dark for far too long. She slipped on a pair of latex gloves handed to her by one of the deputies, who had rushed into the room and carefully lifted the bundle free. The children whispered behind her, voices carrying both fear and excitement, while Diesel's claws tapped anxiously against the floor. His pacing filled the room with a nervous rhythm, back and forth, his ears flattened tight against his head, as if every part of him wanted to bark, but he was holding it in for something worse. The first envelope opened with a soft crack. The paper brittled beneath Claire's fingers. Inside were faded photographs, the kind printed years ago when glossy finish and white borders marked every picture. She held them up to the light. Faces of children stared back, their smiles captured in moments that should have been safe. Birthday parties, soccer games, classroom portraits. Yet on the back of each photo was a name, a date, and a short note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Some simply said missing, others carried words like last seen or transferred. Claire's mouth went dry. She knew some of those names. They were children whose faces had once been posted on flyers stapled to telephone poles, children whose disappearances had never been solved. She moved to the next envelope, her hands heavier now. Inside were pages of handwritten notes filled with numbers and strange abbreviations. At first glance they looked meaningless, but Claire recognized the pattern of addresses, some local, some across county lines, scribbled beside initials and dates. It was coded, deliberate, the kind of writing someone used when they were keeping track of something they didn't want discovered. Her chest tightened as she realized she was staring at evidence, not of a prank, but of something dark and organized. One of the deputies slid the small plastic bag across the desk to her. Inside was a thin black flash drive, simple and unmarked. Claire hesitated only a second before connecting it to the laptop that had been rushed in by the tech team. The screen flickered to life, and at first all they saw was static, lines rolling across the monitor like an old television set. Then the picture steadied. A room appeared, dim and gray, concrete walls and a single dangling light bulb. Claire leaned closer, her pulse hammering. The camera wasn't in some unknown building or distant hideout. It was inside the school itself. The basement. Diesel stopped pacing long enough to whine, his nose pressed to the floor, as if he could smell the memory of whatever had been filmed there. On the screen, a shadow moved, a tall figure pacing through the room, though the face never came into view. In the corner of the basement were shapes no one wanted to name. Small beds, chains bolted into the wall, a bucket tipped onto its side. The teachers gasped, one covering her mouth to hold back a cry. Diesel barked suddenly, sharp and angry, the sound making every child flinch. Claire didn't tell him to stop. Deep down, she felt it too. Whatever had been hidden behind that map was not just history, it was a warning. And Diesel knew better than anyone what was still coming. The hallways of Maple Hollow Elementary were no longer filled with the laughter of children. Instead, they echoed with the heavy boots of deputies and the clipped voices of investigators. The classrooms had been cleared. Parents called. Teachers gathered in the office with pale faces and trembling hands. Claire stayed close to Diesel, her hand firm on his collar, but even she could feel the weight pressing down on the building, as if the walls themselves knew secrets they had kept too long. Diesel's nose was low to the ground, pulling her with steady force, his whole body taut with urgency. No amount of command slowed him. He was following something only he could sense, something no one else could ignore. He dragged her through the back hall, past the cafeteria, and toward the old service wing where few students ever went. The air grew cooler there, damp with the smell of concrete and old pipes. Diesel's growl rumbled deep as they reached the end of the hall. Against the far wall sat a heavy wooden door, reinforced with metal bands. Rust streaked down from its hinges, and an ancient padlock clung to the latch, its surface pitted and scarred with time. Claire had walked this part of the school before during safety checks, and she had always been told the same thing, that the storm cellar had been sealed years ago, that it was unsafe to enter. Now Diesel yanked against his leash, teeth snapping at the lock as if he had waited his whole life to reach it. The principal hurried after them, his words rushed and frantic. He insisted there was nothing behind that door, that it was just storage, that the dog was overreacting. Claire ignored him, her eyes fixed on Diesel, who was clawing at the frame with such ferocity that flakes of old paint rained to the floor. His paws left streaks of blood where the nails split, but he did not stop, not even when Claire tried to tug him back. He was possessed by instinct, driven by something stronger than pain. She shouted for bolt cutters, her voice slicing through the noise of radios and shuffling boots. The deputies hesitated, glancing at one another, waiting for the principal to give some excuse, but Claire's tone carried no room for argument. Diesel howled, a sound raw and full of warning, and it rattled through the hallway until every officer moved faster. The cutters arrived, heavy and red-handled, and Claire seized them herself when no one else stepped forward. She gripped the lock, the metal biting cold against her gloves, and snapped it open with a sharp crack. The pieces fell to the floor like broken chains, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Diesel pushed forward, shoving his weight against the door until the hinges groaned. The smell that rolled out was damp and foul, the kind of rot that spoke of years hidden from light. Claire's stomach tightened, her hand on her weapon, her heart pounding with the knowledge that this was no ordinary basement. Diesel's fur bristled as he slipped into the darkness first, his growl echoing off the stone steps. Claire followed close behind, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. They had opened what was never meant to be opened, and whatever waited below was something only Diesel had been willing to face. The door creaked open wider under the weight of Diesel's body as he surged forward into the dark. A blast of air rushed out from the opening, thick with mildew, damp wood, and a sharper edge of something chemical that burned in the nose and throat. Several officers gagged and pulled their shirts over their mouths, but Diesel didn't hesitate. His nails clattered on the first few steps as he disappeared into the shadows, his low growl rolling up the stairwell like thunder. Claire forced herself to follow, flashlight beam cutting through the heavy dark, every muscle in her body screaming with unease. The stairs ended in a wide concrete floor that stretched out in uneven patches of light and shadow. Claire's beam landed first on a row of bunk beds lined against the wall. They were tiny, clearly meant for children, their frames rusted and thin mattresses torn open with stuffing spilling out like wounds. Blankets were bunched at the edges, faded with age but carrying the faint outlines of cartoon patterns. The sight rooted everyone in silence. No one moved, and even the sound of breathing seemed too loud for a place that had been hidden for so long. Diesel padded forward, sniffing each bed, his ears flat and his fur standing on end. He whined once, then growled as he moved toward the far wall where heavy iron chains hung from bolts driven into the concrete. They rattled faintly, as if remembering the weight they once held. The metal was stained, the floor beneath it scarred. One deputy muttered a curse under his breath and turned away, his hand trembling as he wiped his mouth. Claire's chest ached with a mix of rage and sorrow, her heart pounding at the thought of what had been done here, right beneath the feet of children upstairs who had been learning and laughing while this room lay hidden below. Diesel suddenly froze, his body angled toward the corner of the room. Claire swung her light in the same direction, and her stomach tightened even more. On the ground, surrounded by dust and spiderwebs, sat a camcorder. Its small red light blinked faintly, the only sign of life in a room that should have been dead. Claire crouched and picked it up carefully, wiping grime from the lens. She hit the small screen button, and static filled it immediately, rolling lines of gray and black. But the fact that it was still recording at all made every officer exchange a horrified glance. Someone had been down here recently, someone who had left this place not abandoned, but active. The weight of that truth settled on Claire's shoulders as she turned to see Diesel staring up at her, his amber eyes burning with urgency. His tail was stiff, his breath sharp, and his whole stance screamed that this wasn't over. The camcorder hissed in her hand, its static buzzing like a warning. Around her, the small beds, the chains, the broken toys, and the smell of chemicals told a story no one wanted to believe. Claire whispered into the silence that this wasn't a prank. It wasn't just history. It was still alive. Diesel barked once, sharp and commanding, his voice bouncing off the concrete walls, and in that moment everyone in the room knew it too. The room above the basement had been turned into a command post within hours. Desks were pushed together, laptops hummed, and evidence bags filled with photographs and papers were spread out in neat rows. The children had all been sent home early, escorted by nervous parents who whispered about the police cars surrounding the school. Teachers sat huddled in the library, shaken but quiet, while deputies moved through the halls with clipped voices and grim faces. Claire sat at one of the desks, her gloves still on, her heart still pounding from what she had seen below. Diesel lay at her feet, not resting but tense, his eyes fixed on the box of toys they had brought up from the basement. Every so often his chest rumbled with a growl so low it vibrated against the floor. He couldn't look away from the small dolls, the broken trucks, the stuffed animals with torn seams, as if he could still sense the children who had clung to them in fear. An evidence tech leaned over the desk and handed Claire a page. The handwriting from the envelopes was spread out in rows across the paper, each entry carefully transcribed. At first, the notes looked like strings of nonsense, just initials, dates, and odd markings. But one name kept appearing among the numbers, written in a sharp hand that was impossible to mistake. Mayor Donovan Hale. Claire's stomach clenched so hard she thought she might be sick. She read the name again, then again, hoping she was mistaken. But there it was, on half a dozen entries. Sometimes it was written in full, other times just D. Hale, but it was the same, over and over, mixed with addresses and words like delivered and approved. She set the page down slowly, her hands trembling. The mayor was a fixture in Maple Hollow, a man who had stood at every parade, cut every ribbon, and donated funds for the library, the park, and even the school itself. He was the man parents trusted, the one children waved to when he visited classrooms, the face on every poster at town events. The idea that his name could be tied to the nightmare they had uncovered beneath the school was almost impossible to believe. And yet here it was, written in black ink, page after page. Diesel lifted his head and growled louder, his ears flat, his body lowering into a stance of warning. Claire followed his gaze back to the toys lined on the evidence table. She reached out and picked up a small stuffed bear, its fur matted, one glass eye missing. Diesel barked once, sharp, his teeth bared at the sight of it. Claire felt her chest tighten. She whispered to him that she understood, that he was right, that these weren't just toys, they were proof of what had happened in that basement, ghosts that refused to stay silent. Across the room, an officer muttered in disbelief, saying the mayor had shaken his hand just last week, had patted his son on the head at the farmer's market. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of the parents who had lost their children, who had begged for answers that never came, and she realized the truth was going to tear Maple Hollow apart. Diesel pressed against her leg, steady and unyielding, and she knew he was telling her what she already feared. The beloved man at the heart of the town was not who he seemed, and the evidence in their hands was about to expose him. The room was tense as the tech team huddled around the laptop, their fingers moving quickly over keys while others leaned in close to watch the files open one by one. The flash drive was fragile, old, and filled with strange folders, most of them empty or corrupted. But then a small audio file appeared, no larger than a voicemail. The tech glanced up at Claire, his face pale, and asked if she wanted to hear it. She nodded, her throat dry, her hand tightening on Diesel's collar as if bracing herself. The speakers hissed with static at first, then cracked, then the sound leveled out into something that made the whole room still. A child's voice came through, so soft it almost broke apart, each word trembling like it had been pulled through tears. "He told us no one would believe us," the voice whispered, the kind of whisper that carried more fear than shouting ever could. Claire felt the hair rise on her arms. The deputies around her shifted uneasily, some looking down at their boots, others staring at the wall as if the sound alone was too much to face. Diesel pressed against her leg, whining low, his head pushing into her chest as if to shield her from what they were all hearing. The voice continued, broken by long pauses and quick breaths. "He wore cologne that smelled like pine," the child said, the words barely audible, but clear enough to sting. Pine. Claire's mind reeled back to the basement, to the smell that lingered beneath the mold and damp concrete. It hadn't just been chemicals, it had been something sharper, familiar. She remembered shaking hands with the mayor at a school fundraiser last winter, and how his cologne had filled the air, crisp and woodsy. Her stomach twisted, the bile rising as she realized how deep the truth might cut. The audio played for less than a minute, but when it ended, no one spoke. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves, pressing down like a weight that settled on every shoulder in the room. One deputy finally muttered that the voice could belong to anyone, that they needed more proof. But his words rang hollow. They all knew what they had heard. It wasn't just a voice. It was a cry that had been buried, taped behind a map for years, waiting for someone to listen. Claire stroked Diesel's head, her fingers threading through his fur, and whispered that it was all right, but Diesel didn't relax. His body stayed rigid, his ears back, his eyes trained on the table where the evidence lay. He let out another low whine, almost like grief, and Claire felt her chest ache. It was as if he understood every word, as if he carried the sorrow of the child's voice in his own body. She pressed her forehead to his, promising him and herself that the voice would not be ignored. For the first time in 20 years, someone had listened, and with Diesel at her side, she swore the truth would finally come to light. The sheriff's office had never been so full. Every chair in the lobby was taken, and still parents stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls, their hands gripping old photographs worn soft from years of being carried in wallets and purses. Some of the pictures were creased, others faded, but every face was clear enough to break a heart. 12 children, all gone over the last 15 years, their names etched into the memory of Maple Hollow like scars that never heal. For years these families had begged for answers, had been told the cases were cold, that maybe their children had run away or vanished into the faceless current of the world. Now, with the evidence pulled from the basement and the names scrawled across those hidden envelopes, The truth was beginning to take shape, and it was more horrifying than any of them had been prepared for. Claire stood near the back with Diesel, her hands folded tight to stop their shaking. She had seen her share of sorrow on the job, but nothing like this, nothing that gathered so many broken souls into one room. The parents weren't angry at her, not yet. They were angry at the silence, at the years stolen, at the possibility that someone so beloved in their town might have been involved in their worst nightmares. Their voices rose together, some pleading, some demanding, their grief pouring out into the stale air of the office. Diesel didn't move through it all. He sat with perfect stillness in the center of the lobby, his chest broad, his amber eyes sharp, his tail resting on the tile like a shadow. He was more than a dog in that moment. He was a sentinel, a presence that carried weight, a reminder that someone, at least, had not forgotten to keep watch. When the sheriff laid the photos from the basement out across the table, the sound that filled the room was one of sharp intakes of breath and muffled cries. One mother stepped forward, her hand trembling as she pointed to a picture. Her voice broke as she whispered her son's name. A father followed, clutching his own daughter's school portrait against his chest as if it could protect her even now. One by one the parents connected the pieces, their children's names appearing beside the coded notes, the addresses, the initials. The puzzle that had tormented them for years was finally fitting together, though the picture it formed was too dark to look at without flinching. Claire felt Diesel press against her leg, his body steady as stone, his gaze unyielding as he watched the faces of the families. He didn't blink, didn't rest his head, didn't close his eyes. He seemed to understand that this was not a moment for comfort, but for strength, and he offered it in silence. When one of the fathers dropped to his knees in despair, Diesel rose and walked to him, pressing his nose gently into the man's hand. It wasn't a cure, but it was something real, a promise that at least one creature on this earth would not look away. The sheriff finally spoke, his voice low but firm, saying the cases were no longer cold, that they would not rest until every child's story was brought into the light. Claire glanced down at Diesel, whose eyes stayed locked on the photographs spread across the table. He hadn't slept since the map came down, and she knew he wouldn't until the truth was dragged fully out of the shadows. The town square was crowded that afternoon. Cameras lined up in neat rows, reporters shouting questions over the buzz of the crowd. Maple Hollow had never seen this much attention, not in decades, but the discovery beneath the school had drawn eyes from far beyond their quiet borders. At the center of it all stood Mayor Donovan Hale, polished as ever, his suit sharp, his silver hair combed back, his smile fixed in the way people had trusted for years. Claire stood with the deputies near the stage, her arms crossed, Diesel pressed close to her side. The German shepherd had been restless since they left the sheriff's office, his ears swiveling, his tail stiff, his muscles taut. Mayor Hale raised his hands for silence, the cameras clicking in rapid bursts. He cleared his throat, his voice smooth and practiced, and called the accusations nothing more than lies. He said powerful men always attracted enemies, that fabricated evidence had been planted by those who sought to ruin his reputation and the town's good name. He even laughed, a sound so polished it rang false, but still some people in the crowd tried to smile back, clinging to the image of the man they had believed in for so long. Claire's stomach churned as she watched. The evidence was undeniable. The handwriting, the photos, the audio of the trembling child's voice, yet here he stood, spinning it all away, with words that dripped honey but masked poison. Diesel's chest rumbled with a growl. His eyes locked on Hale with an intensity that made Claire tighten her grip on his leash. She whispered for him to stay calm, but Diesel wasn't hearing her. He knew something deeper, something beyond the reach of human reason. His nose twitched, catching the faint trace of cologne that clung to Hale's suit, pine and sharp. The same smell that had clung to the basement air. Diesel's hackles rose. The mayor leaned forward at the podium, his smile widening as he assured the town that he loved their children, that he would never harm them, that this was nothing more than a witch hunt. And then it happened. Diesel lunged with a suddenness that tore the air apart. His teeth flashed white, his bark exploded like thunder, his body straining against the leash as he aimed directly at Hale. Claire yanked back with all her strength, but Diesel's fury dragged her forward a step, his jaws snapping inches from the stage. The crowd gasped in unison, the sound like a single heartbeat breaking. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouting, children crying as their parents pulled them closer. Hale staggered back from the podium, his smile faltering for the first time in years. The confidence in his eyes cracked, just for a second, as if the mask had slipped and the truth had leaked through. He recovered quickly, forcing the grin back, raising his hands as if to laugh it off. But the damage had been done. Everyone had seen it. Diesel barked again, sharp and relentless, his eyes blazing with certainty. Claire finally pulled him back to her side, pressing her hand against his chest to steady him, but she didn't scold him. Deep down she knew the dog had simply spoken the truth in his own language, and the town had heard it louder than any speech. For the first time, the perfect smile of Donovan Hale looked weak, and the seed of doubt took root in Maple Hollow. The school was silent after dark, its windows black against the night. The playground swings still in the breeze. Federal agents moved in with quiet precision, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the hallways. Claire walked with them, her hand tight on Diesel's leash, though she knew he hardly needed it. His body was tense, his nose low, his ears pricked forward as if every sound in the empty building spoke only to him. The air carried the smell of dust and mildew, the same heavy dampness that had clung to the basement days before, and Diesel pulled hard toward it, like a compass finding true north. Down the old storm cellar steps they went, boots striking the concrete in a rhythm that echoed too loudly in the hollow space. Diesel reached the bottom first and stopped, his hackles lifting as he scanned the shadows. He sniffed once, twice, then moved toward the far wall where the camcorder had once sat. His nose pressed against the bricks, his claws scraping at the edges until flakes of mortar fell to the floor. Claire's heart picked up speed. She crouched beside him, her flashlight beam shaking slightly as it revealed one brick that shifted under her touch. Diesel pawed harder, the sound sharp against the silence, and the wall gave way with a soft crack. Behind the bricks was a cavity just large enough to hold a book. Claire reached in carefully, her gloves brushing over something wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it free and unrolled it to reveal a leather ledger, worn at the edges but thick with pages. The agents leaned in as she flipped it open. Neat handwriting filled every line, names and numbers scrawled in black ink, dates stacked beside them. At first it looked like financial records, but then the words leapt off the page. Pickup, delivery, approved by DH. Beside each set of initials were payment amounts. Coded routes marked by towns and highways. It was a network mapped in plain sight, hidden all these years inside the wall of a school basement. One agent swore under his breath, his voice rough in the still air. Another snapped photos of each page, the flash briefly illuminating the horror in every entry. Claire swallowed hard as she turned another page and saw names she recognized. Children who had filled flyers years ago, children whose parents still clutched photographs in the sheriff's office. Each one listed with a date, a sum, and initials. Diesel whined, pushing his head against her shoulder as though he too felt the weight of what they had uncovered. The ledger was the final nail, undeniable and complete. There was no way to dismiss it as fabrication or rumor. It tied everything together, every whisper, every missing child, every lie the mayor had smiled through. Outside, radios crackled as news of the discovery spread. Federal command confirmed what everyone already knew. Mayor Donovan Hale's empire was collapsing. The man who had ruled Maple Hollow with a perfect grin was now tangled in a web he could not escape, exposed by the one creature who refused to be silent. Diesel stood tall beside Claire, his eyes gleaming in the beam of her flashlight. The guardian who had ripped apart shadows until the truth was forced into the light. The courthouse was packed long before the trial began. Parents filled the benches, their hands clutching photographs of children who had never come home, faces framed with creases from years of searching. Survivors sat in the front row, some now grown, some still young, their eyes holding shadows far older than their years. The air buzzed with whispers and the scratch of pens from reporters, but beneath it all, there was a tension that made every breath feel heavy. Claire sat near the front with Diesel at her side, his chest wrapped in fresh bandages where shards of broken brick had cut him during the raid. He sat tall despite the injuries, ears pricked, his amber eyes steady on the room as though he understood every word that had been spoken since the trial began. Mayor Donovan Hale entered with the same polished air he had always carried, his silver hair combed, his suit pressed, his smile fixed as though this was just another town gathering where he could charm his way through. But the moment the first witness took the stand, cracks began to appear. A young man in his 20s, his hands shaking as he gripped the rail, told the jury about nights spent locked in the basement, about the smell of mildew and pine, about the sound of heavy footsteps, and the promises whispered that no one would ever believe him. His voice trembled, but it did not break, and when he finished, Diesel let out a low whine, leaning against Claire's leg as if to lend his strength to the boy who had carried silence for so long. One by one the survivors spoke. Some barely whispered, others raised their voices through tears, but every story matched the names and notes scrawled in the ledger. Parents broke down as they heard the details, some clutching each other, some covering their faces as though shielding themselves from truths they had always feared but never been able to prove. The courtroom echoed with sobs, yet not a single person turned away. They listened, because the time for silence had ended. Hale's lawyers tried to object, tried to paint the testimonies as fabrications, but each page of the ledger, each photo, each recording pulled from the flash drive, crushed their arguments under the weight of truth. When the child's voice was played aloud for the jury, the trembling whisper about pine cologne, the room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Hale shifted in his chair, his smile faltering, his eyes darting for the first time toward Diesel, who growled softly, low and sure, the sound carrying across the wooden floor like a warning. The jury did not take long. When they returned, the word thundered through the courtroom with a force that made the floor feel unsteady. Guilty, every count. Hale's smug grin vanished, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the verdict he could not charm away. The parents wept openly, some collapsing into each other's arms, others standing to applaud through tears. Survivors clutched one another, their voices breaking as relief finally replaced fear. Claire bent down and wrapped her arms around Diesel's neck, whispering into his fur that they had done it, that he had brought them here. Diesel sat proud, bandaged but unbroken, the sentinel who had refused to let the truth remain buried. The gavel struck, sealing the verdict, but it was Diesel's steady gaze that reminded everyone in the room what real justice looked like. The weeks that followed the trial passed slowly but with a strange kind of lightness that the town of Maple Hollow had not felt in years. The courthouse steps were no longer crowded with cameras, and the sheriff's office no longer echoed with shouts of grief. There was still pain, still wounds that would take years to heal, but something had shifted. For the first time in a long time, people walked through the streets without their shoulders hunched in suspicion or their voices lowered in fear. The truth had been dragged out into the open, and though it hurt, it gave them back a sense of safety they thought they had lost forever. When the school reopened, there was hesitation in the air. Parents held their children close as they walked them up the steps, their eyes flicking to the old storm cellar doors, now sealed with heavy bolts and bright warning signs. Yet, as the children ran through the halls again, their laughter rising to the ceiling, the building felt different, as though it too was breathing easier. Diesel walked proudly beside Claire, tail swaying, ears flicking at the sound of squeals and cheers. Children rushed to him as if he were an old friend, their small hands reaching out to pat his fur. He stood calmly, letting them pet him, his eyes bright, with the same watchfulness that had never left him. In the main hallway, where the county map had once hung, a new mural stretched across the wall. It was not the work of professional painters, but of the children themselves. Bright crayon colors filled the space, Diesel drawn again and again, some with his tongue hanging out, some with his ears standing tall, some as large as giants towering over stick-figure kids. Above all of it, painted carefully in bold letters, were the words, "He saw what we didn't." He gave the lost their voice. Parents stopped in front of it, tears welling in their eyes as they traced the words with their fingers. Survivors who visited the school stood quietly before it, some whispering thank you to the dog who had dragged the truth out from behind paper and plaster. Claire knelt beside Diesel in front of the mural, her hand on the thick fur of his neck. She pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes for a moment. She whispered softly, thanking him for refusing to stop, for pulling her forward when she doubted, for holding the weight of what no one else could bear. Diesel closed his eyes too, leaning into her touch, a quiet huff escaping his chest as if he understood. Around them, the children's voices filled the hall, bouncing off the walls, not with fear, but with joy. For the first time in a long time, Maple Hollow felt safe. The shadows that had clung to the town were pushed back, replaced by light and laughter. And at the center of it all stood a dog who had torn down more than a map. Diesel had torn through silence, through lies, through fear itself. He had shown them that truth could not be buried forever, not while he still had breath to bark. In the eyes of the town, he was no longer just a dog. He was the hero of Maple Hollow, and his watchful eyes promised they would never be blind again. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you liked this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.